This is Patrick BetDavids speaking at America Fest for Turning Point USA, and he made this odd statement about the favor of God.
I'm finally openly talking about my biggest fear I have in life. I fear losing God's favor.
My curiosity was triggered, so I kept listening.
The only reason I share that with you is because when I look at that flag,
excuse me?
I think America, for God knows how many years, has been known as the greatest country in the world. It has forgotten and no longer fears losing God's favor.
Okay, I've got way more questions than answers after watching this video, and I think you might too. Did Patrick BetDavid just equate God's favor to living a prosperous life? My life doesn't look like that. Do I not have God's favor? And is it true that America has the favor of God? These are important questions, and I will answer them in 4 parts in this video. First, we will look at Patrick BetDavid's understanding of the favor of God. Second, we'll look at the Bible to understand what God's favor is. Third, we'll critique Patrick BetDavid's understanding. And then fourth, I will help you understand how you can have God's favor in your life. If you're looking for other content that is looking at culture in the world from a Christian perspective, I would encourage you to look at Lunch on the Way. This is a podcast I do with my friends Graham and Jonathan, and we look at many different topics around the Christian faith and what is actually going on in the world right now. So subscribe to this YouTube channel to watch videos like this, and also to get the podcast as well. Patrick BetDavid is a businessman and media personality for Valuetainment, or PBD podcast. I sometimes see his videos come across my YouTube recommended page, and I honestly never see him give a speech like this, so I was immediately intrigued. He was speaking at Turning Point USA, which is a quasi-Christian political organization that is certainly right-leaning in the US political spectrum. But let's jump right into part 1. Patrick BetDavid's understanding of God's favor. Patrick was mentioning how his biggest fear in life was losing the favor of God. He feared this because he had an incredibly successful life, and he didn't want to lose it. He was hardworking, had many companies, a great family, and global influence. He didn't want to lose that.
I fear losing God's favor.
In this video, he clearly attributes God's favor on his life to the success that he has in life. And then he makes one jump further where he attributes America's success in the world to God's favor on America.
The only reason I share that with you is because when I look at that flag, I think America, for God knows how many years, has been known as the greatest country in the world. It has forgotten and no longer fears losing God's favor.
You see, this is where things get a little bit complicated for me personally. I don't necessarily see prosperity as a sign of God's favor, or even a biblical marker of what it means that God is necessarily on your side, especially after Jesus. God's favor might not look like traditional success or prosperity. If you pick up any book that looks at Christian persecution over the last few centuries, you'll see that God clearly was with these people, but they did not live a traditionally successful life. But they still lived a life for God. Would you say that a Christian martyr or someone who is a persecuted Christian doesn't have God's favor on their life? I wouldn't say so. I'm reading a book right now looking at the early church fathers, and many of them were persecuted for their faith, but clearly God's favor was on them, and they did not see resistance or a lack of traditional success as God not being with them. They believed God was with them all the way, that God's favor was on them, but they did not live an easy life. So what's the Bible's understanding of God's favor? Even from just a cursory survey of the Old and New Testaments, it is very clear to me that God's favor does not necessarily equate a traditional version of success or prosperity. Moses clearly had God's favor, and God clearly used Moses as a person to help deliver God's people out of Egyptian slavery. Yet Moses still wandered in the wilderness for 40 years and never even entered the promised land. He didn't even get to see the fruits of his labor. King David clearly had God's favor. He was anointed by God as king, and he brought unity to the Israelite nation. Yet near the end of his life, he was having to deal with different coups and rebellions in his kingdom, and things were not easy for him at all. King Solomon had God's favor. He built God's temple where God's presence rested in the nation in Jerusalem. Yet, near the end of his life, when he died, the kingdom was split in two and was never unified again. Now, you could argue that Moses, King David, and Solomon all did something that allowed them to lose the favor of God. But I think these situations, and many situations in the Bible, are way more complicated than that. It can clearly be argued that each of the apostles, those who witnessed the resurrection of Jesus, had God's favor on their lives. Yet they each lived very difficult lives that were not traditionally successful. The Apostle Paul, who spread the gospel westward from Jerusalem and Judea and Samaria, he described his situation and circumstance like this. 5 times I received from the Jews 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was pelted with stones. 3 times I was shipwrecked. I spent a night and a day in the open sea. I have been constantly on the move. I have been in danger from rivers, in danger from bandits, in danger from my fellow Jews, in danger from Gentiles, in danger in the city, in danger in the country, in danger at sea, and in danger from false believers. I have labored and toiled and have often gone without sleep. I have known hunger and thirst and have gone often without food. I have been cold and naked. This resume of Paul's makes no sense under a traditional understanding of success and equating that with God's favor. And then we clearly have Jesus as the pinnacle example of what it looks like to have the favor of God. Not only is Jesus God, but Jesus is also fully man. And on earth, the Holy Spirit was obviously with Jesus, and Jesus was acting through and within the power of God. He healed people, forgave sins, cast out demons, did many things to symbolize that God was clearly on his side. But where did that lead him? That led him to a crucifixion on a cross. Jesus and Paul clearly did not live the traditionally successful life. So what the heck does it even mean to have the favor of God? Simply put, I think from a biblical perspective, what it means to have the favor of God is to have God working through you. That his will is done in your life. And to be completely honest, I rarely think this looks like having millions of dollars, having a nice fancy house, a successful life, or even a comfortable life. I think often it looks like some level of traditional discomfort, but really it is God who is comforting you in those situations because God is on your side. So what really is Patrick BetDavids' misunderstanding here? I know it looks like I'm picking on Patrick BetDavid a bit too much right now, but I have no clue who he is. I'm sure he's a great guy. I'm sure he's a nice guy. But what I'm really doing is using him as an illustration to help us really understand what is God's favor and how does that compare to what other people believe God's favor is. And this is the reason why I spent hours writing scripts, editing video, not only filming it, but also producing it, is because I want us to understand that God's favor does not necessarily, and honestly most of the time, does not look like traditional success. I think Western Christian countries are particularly tempted into this way of thinking because they see history as a receding of Christian values and cultural norms, and because of that they believe that the countries or the nations that they're a part of are actually regressing to the point of self-destructing, almost like how Rome did, even though that's not what St. Augustine believed. They think that all that we need to do as a nation is really just bring back all these cultural forms and things, and then all of a sudden God's favor will come back. So how can we have God's favor?
We are now afraid to pray in schools, but we're okay with teaching all these other things to our kids. I'm not okay with that.
I don't think it looks like gathering in all these different pieces of what it externally looks like to be Christian, praying in schools or in government buildings. I think it honestly looks like surrender. I honestly believe that God's favor is given to those who say, "Your will be done, not mine." This favor typically won't look like traditional success, but it will be worth it because you'll be loving God and loving others, and you will, once you experience it, want nothing else. If you're fearing losing God's favor because of not having a successful life, then really, I think success is your God, not God himself. Simply ask to be used by God and say yes every single time. That's what it means to have God's favor.